WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, the current state and future of Black critique. Africa World Now Project is next.
A unifying force.
I think what we have to do is be honest in private and in public. And Brother Coach is a brilliant brother, there's no doubt about that. He's part of the same tradition that I am. I called him on the phone, and I just told him up front. I said, you're an important voice, crucial voice. We come from a tradition that says lift every voice. But from what I can see, there's a difference between somebody blowing the saxophone sounding good and John Coltrane. And I told him, I failed too, but we got to keep standards up. And I'd love to sit down and talk with him. I'd love this. I mean, I'd ask him. You say this is good Negro government tied to Obama and all the good things that it's done. I don't view good Negro government as policies that don't highlight poor people, that have drone strikes, that's tied to Wall Street, that reinforces surveillance. That's not good government for me. You see? So we just have a difference. So I'll just say, Brother Coates, explain to me what you mean. Page 103 in Brother Coates' wonderful text that he just put out. He says, Ossie Davis gave a eulogy for Malcolm X and said, he is our living, shining black man, our black manhood, and the only person that we can say that about today is Barack Obama. I say Barack Obama's no culmination of the legacy of Malcolm X. Please, that is a thoroughgoing misunderstanding of the history of the black freedom struggle. We had to be honest. You can't have a Barack Obama viewed as a culmination of Malcolm X. You misleading a whole generation of people. Malcolm gave too much. The truths he spoke were too deep to be tied to a black face of an American empire. Oh, Brother Coates, you're wrong as two left shoes on this. But we need to sit down and talk about it. If he wants to sit down and talk, I'd love to do it. I'd pay for the meal and the cognac. Oh. Because, because he's a brilliant brother, and we got much to learn from him. I just don't like talking about white supremacy independent of empire and patriarchy, especially of class.
I intentionally started this program with the now viral audio of Cornel West clarifying his recent critique of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Not in an effort to force one to pick one side or the other, but in an attempt to share the words and ideas to encourage us to engage with them. To prime the contextualization of our topic today, not simply as a matter of shallow rhetoric or to stoke the flames of sensationalism, but to encourage each of us to understand the long genealogy of Black critique so that we can move our discourse and praxis beyond the explicit and implicit dualities in thinking and to understand the deep-rooted importance of the ideas and practices that are born from forms of resistance and critical engagement with each other within these forms of resistance for the purpose of refining our human praxis. This program will not engage in a critique of West's critique, nor will it simply critique for critique's sake. We will not be concerned with myopic and non-substantive engagement with superficial sound bites of he said, she said. This program is intent to push the boundaries of Black thought as Black critique. What do I mean? Contextualization is an art that I find an affinity with and seek to perfect, not for personal gratification, but to discover and map a rhythm, much like John Coltrane or an African shaman, that can serve as a spark for our critical consciousness. Our task today seeks to ask critical questions and seek critical answers to those questions. It is also the stated premise of our engagement today to assert that this task is not a simple activity relegated to academia. Black critique is a process of organic and evolutionary resistance to complacency, racial capitalism, colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, neo-imperialism, sexism, racism, as well as any and all forms of discrimination and marginalization against people historically and contemporarily marginalized, centering the African world experience and mapping outward. To understand Cornel West's critique of Coates, one must engage with the long genealogy of Black critique centered on Black reason. Social media has its way of Christopher Columbusing things that have already been for centuries, in fact. The critique of West on Coates is in line with a long tradition of intellectual and ideological engagement, an invocation of critical dialogue and reasoning to discover paths towards freedom, to find ways to correct socio-political wrongs with economic rights, cultural degradation with spiritual revitalization. Black critique is built upon Black reason. This argument is not simply aesthetically racial. Black is used here as a qualifier for resistance, an assertion of African world humanity, a notice that declares it has always been. To understand Black reason is to understand the nature of the universe of thought and action itself, both its negative and positive reactions and responses. As Achille Mbembe writes in Critique of Black Reason, to understand Black reason is to understand what constitutes reason as we know it, the reason of state, the reason of capital, the reason of history. The purpose of Black critique is to produce new ways of being, new ways of thinking, new forms of knowledge. To relegate this process to academia is to lose the universal implications of Black reason, particularly if we accept that knowledge production happening primarily with the Black intellectual elite, who are divorced from communities in which they are, according to Adolph Reed and What Are the Drums Saying Booker, interpreting Blackness for their white audience, or who are a part of what Amir Baraka called the anti-us apartheid movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Today, we intend to start a critical conversation that moves beyond the aesthetic of critique, that by contextualizing West's critique of Coates and the longer genealogy of Black critique centered on Black reason, we intend to call attention to the implications of a fundamental universality of African human praxis. We will explore the current state and future of Black critique with Dean Corey Walker. Dr. Corey Walker currently serves as the Vice President and Dean of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School at Virginia Union University. As a scholar of theology and professor of religion and society, Dean Walker explores the complexities in African American social, political, and religious thought, and has published broadly in African American religion and philosophy, African American history and culture, and religion and American public life. Dean Walker is the author of A Noble Fight, African American Freemasonry and the Struggle for Democracy in America, University of Illinois Press, and has completed the manuscript for his next book titled Between Transcendence and History, an essay on religion and the future of democracy in America. He is editor of the special issue of the journal Political Theology, on Theology and Democratic Futures, and associate editor of the award-winning Sage Encyclopedia of Identity. He has published over 50 articles, reviews, book chapters, and essays appearing in a wide range of journals, such as CLR James Review, Journal of American History, Journal of the American Academy of Religion, to name a few. Dean Walker co-directed and co-produced the documentary film Fightville with acclaimed artist, filmmaker, and University of Virginia professor Kevin Jerome Everson. He was recently named to the task force for the identification of the history of formerly enslaved African Americans in Virginia. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program. I'm here today with Dean Corey Walker. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and yourself?
I'm doing actually very well in this particular moment, which is also a very, very interesting moment. And you know, we had a chance to catch up last week, and we talked about a few things, thinking about a number of things within the context of us as people of African descent here in this Western Hemisphere, but also the African world in general. And I wanted to situate our conversation around two important themes, and we'll kind of branch out as we kind of move through our conversation that will be organic, but kind of ranging around topics or two particular points that I want to impress upon our listeners in this moment or in this session that we're having today. And one of them is the idea of Black critique, but also the role and responsibility. And I know that you do a lot of work in the role and responsibility of Black institutions, but we want to kind of expand upon the conversation of institutions in a more grassroots perspective, but also branch out in a global perspective as well. So if we can start at a very, very broad question, specifically, how do we assess where we are right now as people of African descent here in the United States? And we will move into, and I guess that will move into a question that kind of gets into what are some of the biggest issues or some of the issues that we should be putting in the forefront of our movements and more particularly of our thinking as we move through this year.
Well, James, I think that's a very appropriate question given the current situation that we're in. Our contemporary moment is bisected by some very deep and very problematic issues confronting both our economic lives, our political lives, our social and cultural lives, and most importantly, our planetary lives. I think the one thing that we're all confronting, and this is a confrontation around uh, for all of global humanity, is the question of climate change. And when we think of climate change, we may think of it within a very narrow perspective here in the United States. But thinking about it globally, what we're seeing is we're seeing some very deep and significant shifts in how the Earth is adjusting itself to human existence. And when we think of that, we think of how do we change that? I always like to make the joke or make the comment that the Earth is going to be fine. It's humans that are going to be gone from the face of it. So when we think of all of these issues, our economic lives, our social, political, and cultural lives, we have to be cognizant that they occur within a moment where we're seeing tremendous flux within planetary existence. So when I look at the idea of Black critique, I think of Black critique in its deep and capacious sense, that Black critique has to be grounded within the context of how we respond not only to our planetary existence, but also how do we develop modalities of planetary plenitude for all of humanity. That means that Black institutions, historically Black colleges, Black churches, Black civic associations, Black political and social movements on the ground have a fundamental response to this question, because it is really at the local level where you're seeing collectives of African Americans and Africans throughout the diaspora and on the continent coming together, developing and framing an appropriate agenda around planetary existence that moves us to modalities of planetary plenitude. In so doing, they mobilize modes of Black critique that not only critique existing modes of being, but also develop deep and systemic critiques of those of our contemporary modes of being that are historically attuned, that are aware of possibilities for new modalities of existence that have been overlooked or underdeveloped, and also begin to develop and mobilize human resources as well as community resources to then realize these modalities of planetary plenitude in our contemporary moment. When we connect these local movements globally, whether it be through various global institutional formations or even various Pan-Africanist ideological formations, what we then see is that individuals mobilize these modes of critique that are then attuned to how we think about our planetary existence in the moment of crisis, but also how do we link these modalities of critique and these modalities of existence to then open up to possibilities of planetary plenitude. Examples, contemporary examples, are the decolonization of the university movement that we see going across the globe from throughout the global south, from Latin and South America, throughout the continent of Africa, and even in our South Asian context. What we also see this is in the rise of fighting against neo-fascist and authoritarian populist movements, whether it be in Latin and South America, throughout the Americas, the United States included, as well as throughout Europe. And what also we see is new modalities of folks forming in and around new collectivities and new expressions of these collectivities. It can be around modalities of Blackness, modalities around how do we begin to think about a new Pan-Africanism in the 21st century, as well as modalities around how do we develop alternative formations or re-imbue those formations, such as the World Social Forum, with a new emphasis of regenerating human possibility in a moment of deep and systemic institutional crisis.
So let's back up for a second. So you mentioned you started out by talking about the environment. So the Earth, we can say, is reflecting a crisis in human thought about self, but also in relation to others, not let alone in relation to the natural world.
Yes, I think, the reason I began there is because when we think of the idea of Black critique in Black institutions locally and globally, the appropriate frame for hosting these conversations is so vitally important. All too often, our frames of analysis, our frames of critique, actually absent the very conditions of existence that support human life. In other words, we fail to realize that we're not just in a moment of a crisis in capitalist civilization or a crisis in democratic societies. We're in a very deep and systemic planetary crisis that places all human life and human existence in a moment where it can be eclipsed and eliminated. If our proper frame of reference is the planetary crisis that we are experiencing right now, if that is our reference, then the response will have to take into account that our response has to be holistic, it has to be institutional, and it has to be systemic. And in so doing, it has to look at how do we overturn regimes of knowledge, power, and authority that place planetary existence in a crisis moment. In other words, it's not a reformist agenda that Black critique then engages or begins to articulate. Black critique then becomes a wholesale revolutionary formation to say, how do we begin to define and redefine human existence, both on a systemic level and on a planetary level? That means that when we take into account contemporary codes or contemporary formations in which individuals are organizing around, let's say the decolonization movement, decolonization of the university movement, or when we look at radical formations going on in local communities or even in cities such as Jackson, Mississippi. You're looking at individuals who are looking at change, not just in the everyday, but change in the everyday to affect a planetary wave of change that dictates how we must change human existence itself. That's the mode of Black critique that is holistic, that is planetary, and at root really deeply seeks to authorize a new way of human being and belonging in the world. It means that the issues that we're facing are far beyond just the issues of electoral politics, although they are vitally important in a modality of planetary critique. They are more than just issues of redistributional formations of economics. They are more than just how do we develop ways in which we enable individuals to live in the everyday. In other words, we're talking about the politics of life itself. And I think that is an ideal frame and a deeply informative frame for Black critique. And this is the frame in which many Black institutions take themselves. This is the frame that many Black institutions begin to engage in terms of organizing the everyday. It's not just let me change this local issue in my let's say local issue in my city. It is let me change this local issue in my city so that I may live better and so that others may live better. Once you do that, then the question becomes, how do I then change the systems that create these local issues that I must change? And once you begin to do that, then the question becomes, how do I link up with other movements that are doing this such that the systems in my city are connected to other systems in other cities and other towns and other localities around. So now you're seeing a broader systemic change, but you're not just myopically focused on the local. The local is the lens in and through which we see the global and we come to understand the global.
And it's interesting how this conversation is developing, because I think what is important at this particular point is to kind of look at the current state of Black critique, because what we're talking about now is where it should go, where it should develop, where it should evolve. Many of us, yourself, myself, and others would say that this, what we're talking about has always been the underlying central theme of Black critique. But for some reason, we mainstream media, but also in academic spaces or in institutional spaces. And when we're talking about institutional spaces, we're talking about NGOs, we're talking about, civic organizations as well. There seems to be a dominant narrative that kind of is encapsulated in the shock and awe of Cornel West critiquing Ta-Nehisi Coates, and that even being missed as a very, very vital part of the long genealogy of Black critique. So if we were to say, before we move forward a little bit, how do we understand, what is the current state of Black critique?
This is where, I think the West Coates debate and the response, and it is really indicative of the response, not so much the terms of the debate or the critique, because there's always been a critique of Coates's work, and West has amplified that recently. But West has always had a critique of neoliberalism. I mean, that this runs in a deep genealogy through his own thought. And there have also been others who've been critical of West. I'm remembering an issue of Constellations, a radical journal on the left, where then Lucius Outlaw critiqued Cornel West's notion of Black nihilism, because it emerged in a moment of the 1980s of a deep neoconservative assault on Black institutions, and it was read as a broad front of a new neoconservative move. In many ways, this is where West and someone like a Glenn Lowry came together in agreement. But that came under critique by others within the same orbit. Or you think of the critique of Black feminists and Black womanists against the androcentrism of Black male intellectuals. This was definitely pronounced throughout the 1960s, 1970s, but in the 1990s, it came under new assault, particularly with folks like Patricia Hill Collins and, of course, Bell Hooks. And you had a launch against that, of course, backed by Adolph Reed on the pages of Village Voice. I give that brief snippet to say that Black critique has always been, even in its academic phase, part and parcel of how we begin to engage and refine our ideas. It has a deep genealogy within African and African diasporic letters, not only within our contemporary mode, but also deep within these deep traditions. Yeah, I'm looking at, you just give you an example. There was always the critique by Anna Julia Cooper of Black male intellectuals, and Anna Julia Cooper laid an assault out against Black male intellectuals as early as 1886. It was an essay that then became part of her 1892 classic, A Voice from the South. But in many ways, that critique was about the critique of thinking, a type of thinking that is arrested at its moment of articulation and it's not only arrested, but it is tethered to a deeply Eurocentric logic. And she argues this and says this right in front of Black male intellectuals. And of course, she also recognizes, and she also becomes the great arbiter for W.E.B. Du Bois, particularly Du Bois, her backing of Du Bois writing Black Reconstruction. She was one of the guiding lights behind that. She said she wrote to Du Bois saying, you're the only one who can respond to this deeply flawed, deeply problematic historiography of Reconstruction. And of course, Du Bois then writes Black Reconstruction, that's published in 1935. I say all of that to say that there's a deeper logic and deeper history to Black critique. The responses to the Coates-West debate are indicative of, in a sense, a shallowness in which we think of Black thought and Black critique. That it's reduced to a politics of personality, it is reduced to a politics of privilege, and it's reduced to just the politics of position, particularly generational, such that West now becomes the old man on the scene. And Ta-Nehisi Coates then represents the new millennial dream. And then, of course, the new always has to erase the old. It's really an Oedipal version that the son must always kill the father. I want us to begin to think through and say, No, that isn't necessarily, that's not necessarily historically accurate, nor is it necessary for what we need at this particular moment. What we need are modes of critique that then think that the terrain of our questions are the terrain of the given. I go back to Vincent Harding's 1974 essay, The Vocation of the Black Scholar. And Harding writes that the vocation of the Black scholar is really to find and search for that terrain where new questions emerge. The issue that we have to engage is, what are the questions that are confronting us? We have the question of the political, but that has been a question for African Americans since African Americans came into existence as a quasi entity within a U.S. framework, a United States framework. We've always had this interstitial character, and we've always had this marginal presence. The question that I think that for us that is so new is the question of the planetary crisis that we're in. How do we think of, or what is it that Black critique must do in light of our planetary crisis? It cannot be, I'm taking West side or I'm taking Coat side. In other words, it has to be, what does the emergence of this argument at this time mean for us in terms of dictating the terms of discourse that we're engaging in, and also framing the very questions and responses that we have. We have to go a bit deeper than that. I think, Vincent Harding is right from 1974. We have to search for new questions. The question of our planetary existence, when brothers and sisters across this world are finding that they're without food, they're without adequate, right now there's a crisis in East Africa in terms of food, as well as in terms of sustainability for adequate fresh water. There's right now we have a question around what does that mean for not only political sovereignty, but political stability. When we have a crisis in natural resources, we necessarily have a crisis in political sovereignty and political subjectivity. So we have a number of crises erupting, but if we think that the logic of them can be responded to solely within the political, I think that's where we miss the forest for the forest for the trees, and we have to emerge and think through what are the new questions we have to engage in.
And those new questions are important, and I'm trying to kind of solidify or have a framework of where do we start. And I'm thinking about these new questions because these new questions, I would argue, and their answers are at their most dynamic. The questions are at their most are at the most dynamic at the grassroots level. And
Yes.
what I mean by that is that the creativity and the imagination of people in the most dire situations are very, very important to include in the conversations, because we have, to be honest, D. Walker, at this particular point, we have a Black neoliberal intellectual elite class who is driving this conversation, who are divorced from the community.
I agree with that, and I think what we're facing and what we're confronting is really a crisis not only of knowledge production and reproduction, but also a deep and systemic crisis in terms of which ideas are deemed legitimate, which ideas then are deemed debatable, and which ideas are then deemed eligible for public discourse. So to give you an example, right now there are a number, from where I sit here at the Proctor School, we're part of a global, part of not a national and global movement of churches and faith-based organizations that are responding to climate change through a green the church movement. We held a summit down in Charlotte, North Carolina recently, where we wanted to look at what are the practices around churches being incubators for environmental change on the local level, but then also being initiators of systemic policy responses, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And we know that this becomes a very fraught issue because one of the first things that President Trump did when he first entered office, when his regime entered into office, was to remove us from the Paris Accords. And these Paris Accords, whatever problems we have with them, provided a framework for a global response to climate change. And this global response was crouched within not just how do we respond globally, but it was also crouched within an understanding that our deep issues of deep political crises, economic instability, and human life and human sustainability are rooted within this planetary crisis. So the first thing that President Trump did, was say, no, we're not a part of that, and then reinforce a vicious nativist nationalism that resuscitated and resurrected some of the most vicious forms of white supremacy and made them articulate and legitimate that we've seen in recent years. Now, this becomes quite important because now our questions that we need to respond to are no longer questions around planetary crisis, but are questions that are preoccupied with what's going on in the White House. And the White House becomes the penultimate response. This is where the West Coates critique is preoccupied with. It's preoccupied with a narrow notion of electoral politics, and that narrow notion of electoral politics then must become the absolute terrain for all Black responses. And if we understand Black critique as anything, we understand that Black critique refuses narrow frames of reference, not only for politics, but also for economics, for social and cultural well-being, and for life itself, such that we understand not only their interrelatedness, but we also understand that the questions that we're raising transcend these narrow frames. But all of a sudden, what we have now is a moment where all of our questions are telescoped to this one moment. And all of Black existence is telescoped either to the presidency of the 44th president of the United States, Barack Obama, or the presidency of the 45th president, Donald Trump. If we have only that narrow frame of reference, then Black critique necessarily atrophies and it should die. But if we take an expanded frame and understand that the emergence of an Obama is predicated on a long genealogy of neoliberal politics, the emergence of a white supremacist President Trump regime is predicated on a long genealogy of white supremacist politics that are deeply imbricated within a politics of empire that continues to use and exacerbate the resources of the world. The U.S. represents only 4% of the world's population, but uses over the quarter of its resources, predicated on a rapacious capitalism that needs and sustains and supports empire. Then we understand that the frame needs to be changed. And when we change the frame, then we understand new questions emerge. Then we look at what goes on the ground. Then we look at these formations like Green the Church movement that sees themselves not only as part of just an existence within a U.S. Frame of reference, but see themselves within a cosmic orientation that has planetary possibilities from the actions that are engaged at the local. That's the role of Black critique. That's what Vincent Harding is talking about. And that's the best of Black critique that we have throughout our tradition. What we have right now is really a politics of critique predicated on a politics of capitalist consumption.
We are currently listening to a conversation I recently had with Dean Corey Walker, who is Vice President and also Dean of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. We are discussing the current state and future of Black critique. Continue to enjoy the program. And that becomes very important because if we think about the contradictions in the invocation of white supremacy, it also shows its weaknesses. And what I mean by that is that if we think about the assault that is happening from the current structure in a global sense, we talk about the United States, the Trump regime and the elites, but this is happening in Germany, in Austria, in other places. There's a clear assault on the commons, a closing of the ranks of a white elite that leaves everybody else out.
You're exactly right to highlight this, because what we're seeing across Europe, Holland, Germany, Austria, what we're seeing, the rise of parties in the Americas. I mean, we think about what's going on in Colombia. This assault on the commons is a retreat to a deeply submerged but always already existent form of white supremacist politics that's already there. It's being activated. I remember writing a piece back in 2012 about the gift of white supremacy. We remember what Mitt Romney, who then lost to Barack Obama, what he articulated. Mitt Romney said Obama won because he made promises to a class of others, African Americans, Latinos, certain classes of women of color, that, of course, this was basically a form of how do you give out the goods and services of white people to the undeserving black and brown people. Deeply, when we think about the assault on the commons, it is a commons that was always already predicated on a notion that the commons belong to a white Anglo-Saxon male. When you have immigration, when you have movement of peoples, the movement of black and brown bodies must always be policed, it must always be curtailed, and it must always be contained. The movement of white bodies is seen as the logic of globalization, the logic of civilization, the logic of our 21st century destiny. This assault on the commons is a deep assault on how we think of ownership of the planet. And of course, the ownership of the planet since the beginning of modernity is a ownership of Europe. But what you're seeing in response to this is that folks from the global South, folks throughout North Atlantic civilization who are challenging these regimes, have to now begin to deal with how the regimes are reorganizing. The revolution always always entails a counter-revolutionary movement. Recently, in an interview, Noam Chomsky stated that he never understood, or he had never imagined the depth and strength of the reaction of the United States against the revolutions of the 1960s. He said he should have, but he never did. And what he's saying now, in reflecting on all of what he's done, his deep and long-standing commitment to movements, both local, national, and global, for change and progressive change, is that he did not understand how deep the reaction would be. And he didn't understand how swift it would move to an institutional level, and how swift it would move to then try to consolidate its gains through an ideological formation. Meaning, we can't even think of an assault on the commons because we don't see anything in common. We don't see how movements for change are connected at the local level, how they're connected with other movements nationally, or how they're connected with other movements globally. Give you an example. Think of the movements of I Am a Man, or Aren't I a Man and a Citizen, that we saw during the abolitionist phase. We also have it reorganized along lines of gender with Aren't I a Woman by Sojourner Truth, to the assertion of the Memphis strikers, Memphis garbage strikers in the 1960s, culminating in the 68 assassination of King, to I Am a Man, to even our contemporary moment, Black Lives Matter. These are all fundamental expressions of new modes of human being and belonging in the world, new modes of Black worth, dignity, and the value of Black existence. But in many ways, we cannot see the connection between these movements and their ultimate aim of overturning regimes of power, and authority, not to just make a space for Black lives, but by fundamentally asserting that Black lives matter. You are fundamentally asserting that there's a new modality of being human in the world, and that new modality of being human necessarily implicates us in a project of thinking through how do we develop new modes of the commons and of community in light of our new way of understanding collective valuing of humanity. That means that the assault on the commons are part and parcel of a larger assault on the very idea of what it means to be human, to which you've seen a mobilization across 2 to 3, 4 centuries of how do we begin to eradicate a narrow notion of humanity to a broad, expansive notion of humanity. That's what's at stake. And this is ensconced in a moment of planetary crisis where if we don't do this, if we don't recognize our commonness, if new commons that recognizes the worth, value, and dignity of all human life, we can see the eradication of all human life, or the lives of those who are deemed to be less human.
And let's look at this material expression of the attack of what we would call net neutrality. Being connected, of course, most of us are connected through our phones and through all of the media, the technology that was there. And if we look at the mobilization, and it was very important, and I hope that you can repeat that genealogy of moving through moving to the Memphis, moving before Memphis, the I Am a Man campaign, all the way to Black Lives Matter. If you could repeat that, because I think that's important for our listeners and for everyone to think about. You just laid out a genealogy that goes back centuries, and it manifests itself into the Black Lives Matter movement that started as a hashtag and now is being assaulted. Because the assault on doing the abolitionist movement and doing the Memphis strike, of course, we know those particular points, but being able to creatively see those connections is very interesting in this particular moment, because most of the things that we have right now, they come through, technology, right? So that's an important point to talk about, right?
I think it's vitally important, because what net neutrality does is net neutrality enables us to utilize various mediums to create new forms of community, new forms of the commons. The assault on net neutrality is the actual continuation of a regime that seeks to isolate and atomize human existence, such that these new forms of community come under assault by saying you cannot come together through the free exchange of ideas and debate. Now, that's vitally important, because what you're seeing through, when we look at, take that genealogy of Aren't I a Man to Black Lives Matter, 19th century all the way up to the 21st century. What you see is the formation of these ideas in and through mediums where individuals can exchange ideas. You think of John Russwurm's newspaper. You think of Frederick Douglass's The North Star. You think of the Alfred Lord Lord Garrison's newspapers. You think of the ways in which individuals like Martin Delany serialized the novel Blake to begin to look at how various forms of revolutionary formations operate. You think of what Henry Louis Gates talks about, the Republic of Arts and Letters. The reason why letters and communication were so vitally important to revolutionary formations. These are so important to connect communities. Just recently, I was doing a study here in Richmond of Gabriel's rebellion. Now, I wrote a part of a chapter in my book on Gabriel's rebellion, but I started walking down Brook Road in the course of to Young Spring and to the two bridges where Gabriel got together with others and conspired to lead this large-scale revolution. The thing that scared then Governor Monroe the entire Virginia gentry, was the scale and scope of this rebellion. And the question became, how did these individuals communicate this scale of rebellion? How did they do this? And so how do we then curtail it? One way in which they curtailed it, and then of course it came into the forefront with Nat Turner after 1831, was that no African Americans, no enslaved African Americans could engage in any large scale gathering or religious instruction without a white male overseer. You also saw the widespread curtailing of education. What you're trying to, what they're saying is, you cannot have the free exchange of ideas. This is what this is what the assault of net neutrality means. You can no longer have the exchange of ideas, the free exchange of ideas, because the internet has been used to foment not only political rebellion, but it can also be used to foment the possibilities of political revolution. When you want to curtail that, you have to assault the very medium in and through which these messages can be guided. It's no guarantee that the messages will be to a certain revolutionary end, because these same mediums can be used to foment certain modes of existence that are deeply antithetical to new modes of human being and belonging. But what we see with net neutrality is, at the moment of the launch of Black Lives Matter, at the moment where you have the Me Too movement, at the moment where you can have the new Poor People's Campaign, it is at this moment where you have the clamping down of the free exchange of ideas, in and through which everyone is connected. Then you also have this idea that this assault is necessary. This assault then becomes legitimate. This assault becomes, in many ways, the lack of sustained engagement with the repeal of net neutrality demonstrates the sort of the ideological closure of the commons, that folks don't think that this is important. But I'm always hopeful that in as many ways as folks can gather together, can organize new modes of being, then I think you'll see the ways in which folks mobilize in new and dynamic ways. You can never stop ideas, and you can never stop people, and that's what makes me hopeful, James.
And me too, because I mean we have a historical record that shows that at every particular point there was also a counterpoint, albeit in an embryonic form, but it eventually developed, as you just shown, this genealogy. As we move into the latter part of this conversation, I want to kind of now really focus our attention on this idea of the idea of human existence that we're talking about as the crux of this conversation, generated from a conversation within this conversation that we're having about Black critique and the role and responsibilities of Black institutions. I'm thinking Sylvia Wynter. The idea of the human, specifically in the African world, is inherited from a particular and a contradictory understanding of human from a European Enlightenment period. So if we're going to move into a new human existence and start to think about this idea of what it means to be human, and we can, looking at Sylvia Wynter's work and others' work, how does that conversation look? What is some of the first steps that we need to really, because I want to make sure that our listeners understand that what we're talking about here, when you're listening to this and you listen to it and hear there's a lot here. There's a lot of teeth here. There's a lot of material here. But let's kind of frame it for them within the context of where will we start? How do we begin to kind of throw off this old 14th century thinking?
Well, James, I think you're right. The conversation that we're having, began with the idea of Black critique and Black institutions, and thinking through them both at the local and global level. And what we offered was the proper framing, or how do we host these ideas. And we said that the hosting of these ideas cannot begin with just a truncated notion of Black critique a la Coates and West, nor can it begin with truncated understandings of Black institutions and their relations to promoting new ways of thinking and new ideas. Instead, we have to begin in a framework that understands our particular planetary crisis on one hand and ideas for planetary plenitude on the other. When we have that framework, when we think through this as a moment of planetary crisis where human life can be eclipsed, human life and animal life, we're in the moment where we're seeing the extinction of large swaths of animal populations that goes unremarked in our dominant media, but is coming more and more to the forefront within our environmental concern circles and our circles around climate change. When we think through planetary crisis, we understand that those populations that are most precarious, those populations marked by Black and brown skins, are the ones who are at the front ends of what we think of as climate change. And it is no accident that our concern with climate change, particularly in North Atlantic civilizations, can be eclipsed simply because it does not engage those very lives and those very communities. But it is these communities who are at the front end. So if we're going to begin to think of Black critique and Black institutions, we have to then think of those individuals whose very precariousness is at the very forefront of a hostile environmental regime, whether it be floods, whether it be traumatic storm events and responding from them, whether it be traumatic hurricane events. Just think of right now Puerto Rico. When we look at Puerto Rico, the reason it can exist like that in this liminal state, where still 30 to 40% of the island is without electricity, is because of the population of people who live there. It is these people who have been deemed redundant, these people whose lives do not matter. In many ways, these people who do not rise to the level of being human like everyone else. So if we take that frame, then we know that our notion of what it means to be human is truncated. Our notion of what it means to be human is always already arrested. It is tethered to an existence of those imperial elites who had the privilege of defining what it means to be human, and by extension, how do we then develop a world organization that reinforces that narrow conception of humanity. Sylvia Winters has done an exemplary job in developing a genealogy of this. But I would argue, and I would argue with Winter, that a lot of this is with what we see in the practices of everyday folks on the island of Jamaica, where Sylvia is from, where we see in practices. You think of Walter Rodney's Grounding with My Brothers in 1968. How do we think of practices around, someone like Charles Long and his notion of significations? These are all emerging at the same moment, or even in this moment when we think of King's notion of the beloved community. Here, King is announcing a new ideal of what it means to be human in the world. In many ways, this is why King is misrepresented. We can't understand King except within a framework that wants to define humanity within those narrow confines. But King says, no, it's a new humanity that we're establishing. It is a new mode of being. And this is what he, goes on to dramatize with the Poor People's Campaign. So I would argue, and I would point our listeners to thinking through how to host those particular issues within a framework that gives the primacy of position to the ways in which human life has been deemed precarious, human life has been deemed redundant, and human life has been deemed expendable. We can do that within a mode of planetary crisis that then says that certain populations can be lost, certain populations will be lost. That's acceptable. When we realize that through planetary change, then we understand that there's a conception of what it means to be human that's operating that then deems some lives more valuable than others. When we recognize that, we connect it to a normative term of planetary plenitude, meaning what are those movements that are trying to overturn the regimes of existence that we have in the everyday? Those movements that are seeking to authorize new modes of community, those local movements that are trying to reorganize government, that are trying to reorganize the ways in which we organize ourselves societally, local movements that are trying to reorganize how do we educate ourselves. When we then look at those movements, they are articulating something other than the movement of planetary crisis. They're articulating a new way of being human in the world. It may not be explicit, but it is implicit in their very practices. That's why these movements have new modes of community. They're fashioning new languages. They're fashioning new ways of communication. They're not only connecting through through social media, they're also connecting through meetings, through community formations, through community organizations. They're organizing, a number of folks are organizing in and around, we can take a date, April 4th, 2018. They're organizing with Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign. They're organizing every day to say that the folks who have been deemed expendable, the folks who have been deemed redundant, are not redundant nor expendable. They are articulating a new mode of being human. And that's what individuals are doing every day. They don't, in many ways, this particular explanation that I'm offering is a way in which folks have always already continued the struggle to define and redefine what it means to be human. I need not go to a whole genealogy of European logic on this. In many ways, I just need to pay attention to the everyday and the ways in which communities across this nation and across this world are organizing themselves and are saying, I exist, I am, and as I exist and I am, we are creating a new existence that we all exist and that we are. And in so doing, we're creating a new heaven and a new earth.
And that's a very, very important point, and that's a good way to kind of end with our listeners thinking deeply about the processes of identifying and mapping the thoughts and actions of everyday people in the African world. We're talking with Dean Corey Walker, Dean of Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University, and also Vice President of Virginia Union University in Richmond, Virginia. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, James. I really enjoyed it.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all of your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research and content contributor contributor and production director, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui. Senior research and content contributor and production associate, Dr. Josh Myers. Technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology. And creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC 90.5 FM, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.